The Book of Jubilees, also called the Little Genesis, is a fascinating ancient text that retells stories from the Bible, from creation to the time of Moses, but with added details and insights. It is written as if the angel of the presence is speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, explaining how God's plan unfolded in a structured, detailed timeline. The book divides history into jubilees, which are cycles of 49 years, making it a kind of heavenly calendar of events. And if you love content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and watch until the end. It highlights themes such as God's covenant, the sanctity of the Sabbath, and the importance of living in obedience to God's commandments. Creation and the heavenly calendar. The story of creation in the Book of Jubilees provides more than just an account of how the world began. It introduces a heavenly calendar based on cycles of 49 years, or jubilees. This calendar forms the framework for understanding time, festivals, and the divine order. In the beginning, God creates the heavens, the earth, and all living beings in 6 days. Each day reveals an aspect of His power, wisdom, and creativity. Day 1. Light is spoken into existence, separating day from night. Alongside this, God creates angels, including the angel of the presence, who serves as a witness to His work and plays a significant role in the unfolding narrative. Day 2. The firmament separates the waters above from the waters below, creating the sky. Day 3. Dry land appears and vegetation flourishes under God's command. Day 4. The sun, moon, and stars are set in the sky, establishing the seasons, days, and years. Day 5. The waters and skies come alive with fish and birds. Day 6. Land animals are created, and finally humanity, Adam and Eve, are formed in God's image to have dominion over creation. Day 7. God rests, not out of need, but to set a divine example of rest and worship. The seventh day is sanctified, becoming a perpetual sign of God's covenant with creation. The Book of Jubilees emphasizes the Sabbath's eternal nature. It is not just for humanity, but for all creation to honor. Even angels in heaven observe the Sabbath, highlighting its universal importance. The Sabbath becomes a cornerstone of faithfulness, and breaking it is seen as a violation of God's order. The story of Adam and Eve is one of the most well-known and foundational accounts in biblical history. It unfolds as a tale of divine creation, perfect harmony, tragic rebellion, and the enduring hope for restoration. In the beginning, God formed Adam from the dust of the earth. With great care, He breathed life into Adam's nostrils, and the first man became a living being. Adam's creation was unique. He was made in God's image, given a soul, and imbued with intelligence, creativity, and a heart capable of love and worship. To provide Adam with a home, God created the Garden of Eden, a paradise filled with every kind of beautiful tree and delicious fruit. A crystal-clear river flowed through it, watering the lush greenery. In the center of the garden stood 2 special trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Yet, despite the beauty and abundance around him, Adam felt alone. God, in His wisdom, declared, "It is not good for man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." God caused Adam to fall into a deep sleep and took one of his ribs. From it, He fashioned Eve, the first woman. When Adam awoke and saw her, he exclaimed with joy, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." Adam and Eve lived in perfect harmony, walking with God in the cool of the day and tending to the garden. They were innocent, pure, and unashamed, knowing only the goodness of their Creator. Their blissful existence, however, was not without boundaries. God commanded them, "You may eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die." One day, a cunning serpent, a vessel of deception, approached Eve. It questioned her, twisting God's words, Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? When Eve replied that they must not eat or even touch the forbidden fruit, lest they die, the serpent lied. You will not surely die. God knows that when you eat it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Eve, captivated by the serpent's words and the fruit's beauty, reached out, plucked it from the tree, and took a bite. She gave some to Adam, who also ate. At that moment, their eyes were opened, and they realized they were naked. Overwhelmed with shame, they sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves. When God came to walk with them, they hid among the trees. God called out, "Where are you?" Trembling, Adam confessed, "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." God's heart grieved as he asked, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree I commanded you not to eat from?" Adam blamed Eve, and Eve blamed the serpent. The consequences were severe. The serpent was cursed to crawl on its belly, and hostility was placed between its offspring and humanity. Eve was told that childbirth would bring pain, and Adam was told that the ground would now produce thorns and thistles, making his labor difficult. God clothed Adam and Eve in garments of animal skin, a sign of his mercy even in judgment, and expelled them from Eden. An angel with a flaming sword guarded the entrance, preventing them from accessing the tree of life. Sin had entered the world, and with it, death. Outside the garden, life was hard. Adam and Eve toiled to grow food and provide for their family. Yet, even in their struggles, they did not forget God. They taught their children to worship him and follow his ways. Though they had lost Eden, the hope of redemption remained. God's promise of a future Savior who would crush the serpent's head gave them courage to face the challenges of life. Their story, though marked by sorrow, carried the seeds of hope for all humanity. Adam and Eve, after their exile from Eden, experienced both the pain of their sin and the hope of new beginnings. Their firstborn Cain was a symbol of their resilience, a tiller of the ground, laboring to bring forth life from the cursed soil. Later, Abel was born, a gentle soul who found joy in tending sheep, nurturing life instead of wrestling with the earth. Though their paths diverged, they grew up under the same lessons: the love of God, the consequences of disobedience, and the hope of redemption. In time, the brothers sought to honor God with offerings. Cain brought the fruits of his fields, showcasing the work of his hands. Abel, however, selected the finest lamb from his flock, offering it with a heart full of reverence and gratitude. When the moment came to present their sacrifices, Abel's offering pleased the Lord, and his altar blazed with divine acceptance. Cain's offering, however, was rejected, not because of the gift itself, but because of the bitterness hidden in his heart. God, seeing Cain's growing anger, warned him lovingly. "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Yet Cain did not listen. Instead, jealousy began to consume him. Cain's envy reached its peak one fateful day. He approached Abel and invited him to the fields under the guise of brotherly companionship. The air was serene, the earth rich with the fruits of their labor, but Cain's heart was clouded with rage. Suddenly, in a moment of blind fury, Cain struck Abel. The younger brother fell lifeless to the ground, his innocent blood soaking the soil. Cain, horrified yet defiant, became the first to take the life of another, a grievous act that forever scarred humanity. The Lord's voice broke through the silence, calling out, "Cain, where is your brother Abel?" Cain, hardened by his guilt, retorted, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" But God's voice thundered with justice and sorrow. "What have you done?" Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth. Cain's punishment was severe, yet he pleaded, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Anyone who finds me will kill me." In his mercy, God placed a mark upon Cain, a divine sign to protect him from vengeance. Though condemned to wander, Cain carried the mark as a reminder of both his sin and God's grace. Cain departed to the land of Nod, east of Eden, where he began a new life, far from God's presence. He built a city and had descendants, but the weight of his actions never left him. Abel's life, though short, stood as a testament to faith and righteousness. His legacy lived on, echoing through the generations as an example of worshiping God with a pure heart. The story of Cain and Abel is a profound tale of humanity's struggles, the battle between envy and contentment, sin and righteousness, judgment and mercy. Cain's path reminds us of the dangers of harboring bitterness and jealousy, while Abel's life encourages us to offer our best to God with sincerity. Even in the face of failure, the story shows that God's justice is tempered by his mercy, offering hope for redemption even to the fallen. After the fall of Adam and Eve, the world began to grow, and generations followed. Adam and Eve had many children, but their son Seth became the one to carry on the righteous line. Seth was a child born in the image of his father, and he walked in the ways of the Lord. Through Seth, God's promises would continue. As time passed, Seth had a son named Enosh. People began to call on the name of the Lord more and more. It was through this line that God would eventually bring hope to the world, a hope that would one day lead to the Savior. Seth's descendants were known for their faithfulness, and they remembered God's commands. Their lives were marked by a desire to live righteously in the way of the Lord. But the world was changing. As humanity grew, so did the number of people who turned away from God. The line of Seth, though faithful, was not alone in the world. The children of Cain, who had walked in darkness and disobedience, began to multiply as well. Over time, people forgot the ways of God, and their hearts became full of wickedness. Sin spread like a disease. People were driven by selfish desires, greed, and violence. The earth was filled with corruption, and evil filled the hearts of men. The more people there were, the more sin seemed to grow. Hatred and murder were no longer unheard of, and the world became a place where righteousness was hard to find. Despite the growing darkness, there was still a remnant of hope. The descendants of Seth continued to honor God, and they taught their children the ways of righteousness. However, as time went on, the line of Seth and the line of Cain began to intermix, and the gap between the righteous and the wicked became harder to see. As the years passed, the wickedness of humanity reached new heights. The hearts of men were filled with pride, and they sought to build mighty cities and towers to make a name for themselves, forgetting the God who had created them. Violence and corruption filled every corner of the earth. People's eyes were blinded by their own desires, and they began to live without regard for the Creator. This rising sin did not go unnoticed by God. Though he had been patient with humanity, he saw that the earth was filled with violence, and he regretted that he had made man. The Lord's heart was grieved, but he also knew that there would be a way to restore his creation. In the midst of all the wickedness, God found favor with one man, Noah. Noah, a descendant of Seth, was a righteous man who walked with God. He stood as a beacon of hope in a world that was rapidly falling apart. God would use Noah to preserve a remnant of humanity, and through him, a new beginning would emerge. But for now, the story of humanity's rise in sin and the scattering of the faithful continued, as the earth became more and more corrupted. And yet, the promises of God remained. Enoch, the man who walked with God. Enoch was a man of deep faith, a rare soul in a time when wickedness was spreading across the earth. From a young age, he chose to walk in the ways of the Lord, and his life shone as an example of godliness and virtue. While many turned away from the path of righteousness, Enoch stood firm. He would often spend hours alone, communing with God, and in turn, his understanding of divine truth grew stronger. Enoch knew the importance of teaching others the ways of God, and he made it his mission to spread the knowledge of righteousness. Wherever he went, he would share the wisdom he had received from God, speaking of love, justice, and purity. People listened closely as his words were filled with truth and peace, something that was so rare in those days. Despite the growing wickedness, Enoch's heart remained pure, and his actions reflected his unwavering devotion to God. His righteousness wasn't just in the things he said, but in the life he lived. He cared for the poor, helped the needy, and always sought peace. Enoch's life was a living testament to the possibility of living in harmony with God, even in a world full of corruption. His family saw him as a role model, and his children grew up understanding the importance of honoring God in every aspect of life. As the years passed, God was pleased with Enoch's unwavering devotion. He had lived a life of holiness and obedience, and his faithfulness did not go unnoticed. One day, as Enoch walked with God, something incredible happened. He was taken up into heaven without tasting death. It was as if the heavens themselves reached down and embraced him. Enoch did not experience the natural end that all men must face. Instead, he was simply taken into the presence of God, a reward for his faithful life. This moment was both mysterious and glorious. The earth looked on, but no one could understand the wonder that had just occurred. Where Enoch once stood, there was nothing but the wind, whispering a gentle reminder that God had chosen to honor his servant in a most extraordinary way. Enoch was no more. He had been taken directly into God's presence, spared from death, and given the ultimate reward for his faithfulness. But Enoch's journey didn't end there. According to ancient writings, he is also credited with writing several books of wisdom, which were inspired by the divine. These books held incredible insights into the mysteries of the universe and God's plan for humanity. Enoch's wisdom was sought after by many, as his teachings not only spoke to the heart, but also to the deeper mysteries of the divine. He wrote about God's justice, his mercy, and the future of the world, offering wisdom that would guide generations to come. Enoch's life is remembered as one of the few who truly walked with God. His devotion and closeness to the Creator set him apart from others. His ascension is a powerful reminder that living a righteous life brings us closer to God, and in return, God rewards us in ways that go beyond human understanding. Enoch, the man who walked with God, left behind a legacy of faithfulness, wisdom, and a deep connection to the divine. The story of Noah and the flood. In the ancient world, the earth had become a dark place, filled with violence and sin. People had turned away from God, chasing after their own desires and ignoring the beauty and purpose of creation. The land was tainted by greed, hatred, and corruption. Wickedness spread like a disease, and humanity no longer cared for the ways of righteousness. It seemed as though there was no hope left, and the world was on the brink of destruction. Yet, in the midst of this darkness, there was one man, Noah. He was different. He walked in integrity and sought after God. While the rest of the world was lost in sin, Noah remained faithful and pure in heart. Noah's faith. One day, God looked down upon the earth and saw that Noah was a man who still followed him. God decided that he would not allow the world to continue in its evil ways. He told Noah that he was going to send a flood to cleanse the earth, but Noah and his family would be spared. God instructed Noah to build an ark, a massive boat that would carry his family and pairs of every kind of animal to safety. The task seemed impossible, but Noah's faith never wavered. He trusted God completely. Even when the people around him mocked him, saying he was crazy to build such a giant ark in the middle of dry land, Noah continued to obey God's instructions. He spent years constructing the ark, praying and trusting that God would deliver on his promise. Noah's unwavering obedience and prayers were a testament to his faith. He knew that God was faithful, and he believed that the flood would come just as God had said. As he worked, Noah told the people of the coming judgment, but they refused to listen. Their hearts were hardened, and they continued in their sin. When the ark was finally completed, Noah and his family entered, and God closed the door behind them. The rain began to fall, and the flood waters rose, covering the earth and wiping away the wickedness. The covenant with Noah. After the flood waters receded, Noah and his family emerged from the ark to a new world, cleansed by the judgment of God. It was a world of second chances, a world where humanity had the opportunity to start fresh. God made a covenant with Noah, promising that he would never again destroy the earth with a flood. As a sign of this promise, God placed a rainbow in the sky, a beautiful reminder of his faithfulness and mercy. From that day forward, the rainbow would symbolize the enduring promise that God keeps his word. God also established dietary laws for Noah and his descendants, instructing them on how to live in harmony with his creation. The earth was peaceful again, and Noah and his family were entrusted with the care of the world. They would be the new ancestors of the nations to come, and God's blessings would continue to flow through them. The division of the earth. As time passed, Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, grew and began to establish their families. God's plan was unfolding, and the earth began to be populated again. Noah's sons divided the land among themselves, each of them taking responsibility for different regions of the earth. Shem's descendants would become the ancestors of the Semitic peoples, including the Israelites. Ham's descendants would settle in Africa, while Japheth's line would spread to the farthest reaches of the earth. Each family's descendants would grow into great nations, with different languages, cultures, and customs, marking the beginning of the diverse world we live in today. God's promise to Noah and his family had been fulfilled, and through them, the earth would be filled with people once again. Though humanity had fallen into sin, God's mercy and grace were stronger. His covenant with Noah marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the world, where the seeds of hope, redemption, and restoration were planted for generations to come. Abraham, the friend of God. In a distant land, there was a man named Abram, later called Abraham, who lived among his people in the city of Ur. He was a man who had heard many stories of the Creator, but he had not yet encountered God personally. One day, as Abraham stood by his home, he heard a voice, clear and strong, calling him. It was God himself, calling Abraham to leave his familiar life behind and embark on a journey to a land he would show him. God promised to make Abraham the father of many nations, and that through his descendants the world would be blessed. With nothing but faith in God's word, Abraham gathered his belongings, his wife Sarah and his nephew Lot, and set off on the long, uncertain journey. He trusted that God would guide him, even though he did not know exactly where the road would lead. As he walked into the unknown, Abraham's heart was full of hope, his steps steady with obedience. The story of Abraham is not just about a journey across the land, but about the deep faith Abraham had in God. He left everything he knew, the comfort of his home, the people he loved, and stepped into a future unknown. This journey was not without its struggles. There were times of doubt, moments when Abraham questioned God's plan, but his faith never wavered. He continued to trust God, knowing that he had a purpose greater than Abraham could see at the time. The land he was promised was full of challenges, but each step of the way, God reaffirmed his covenant with Abraham, assuring him that his faithfulness would be rewarded. The call was not easy, but Abraham's obedience was a testament to his trust in God's promises. Years passed, and Abraham's faith continued to grow. God had promised him that he would be the father of many nations, but Abraham had no children. He and Sarah, though faithful, were both growing older. Yet, God's promise remained true. One day, God appeared to Abraham again, this time with a new covenant, a symbol that would bind Abraham and his descendants to God forever. God told Abraham to circumcise himself and every male in his household as a sign of their covenant. This would be a physical mark, a reminder of God's everlasting promise. Though Abraham was old, he obeyed without hesitation. He trusted that God's plan was greater than any discomfort or challenge he might face. From that day on, every male in Abraham's household, from his servants to his children, bore the mark of God's covenant. The act of circumcision was not just a physical change. It was a spiritual one. It was a commitment to follow God's will, to live a life set apart for him. For Abraham, this covenant was a declaration of his devotion, a sign of his trust in God's plan, even when he couldn't fully understand all of it. Sarah, too, would eventually conceive Isaac, and through this son, God's promise of numerous descendants would begin to take shape. The covenant of circumcision would continue through generations, marking God's people as his own. Abraham's faith was tested in the most difficult way. When Isaac, the promised son, was finally born, he brought joy and hope to Abraham and Sarah. But as Isaac grew older, God called Abraham to an unimaginable test. God asked Abraham to sacrifice his beloved son Isaac as a burnt offering on the mountaintop. This command was a trial that shook Abraham to his core. How could God ask such a thing? Yet in his heart, Abraham knew that God's ways were higher than his own understanding. With heavy heart but unwavering faith, Abraham set out on the journey with Isaac. Isaac carried the wood for the sacrifice, not knowing what lay ahead. As they reached the mountain, Abraham prepared the altar, and just as he was about to sacrifice Isaac, an angel called out from heaven, stopping him. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," the angel said. "Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." God then provided a ram caught in a thicket, and Abraham sacrificed it in place of Isaac. Abraham's faith was proven, and God reaffirmed his promises to him, promising to bless his descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. The moment when Abraham raised the knife was the climax of a lifetime of faith. His love for Isaac was deep, but his love for God was even deeper. He didn't understand why God had asked him to sacrifice his son, but he trusted God with everything in his heart. Isaac, too, demonstrated incredible faith in his father and in the God he worshipped. Together they faced this trial, not knowing how it would end, but knowing that God would provide. When the angel intervened, it was a moment of great relief and joy. Abraham's test of faith was over, but its legacy would live on forever. The ram provided by God became a symbol of his provision, and the story of Abraham and Isaac would be remembered as a powerful testament to unwavering faith, obedience, and trust in God's plan. Abraham's journey was one of faith from the very beginning, and every step he took revealed a deep trust in God's promises. When God called him to leave his homeland, It was not just a journey of distance, but a journey of the heart. Through challenges, uncertainties, and tests, Abraham learned to trust God more deeply. The covenant of circumcision was not just a physical act, but a powerful reminder that God had chosen Abraham and his descendants to be set apart. It was a sign of commitment, a daily reminder of the bond between Abraham and his Creator. The test with Isaac was perhaps the most difficult moment in Abraham's life, but it was also the moment when his faith was made complete. God's provision of the ram showed that he always provides for his people when they trust in him fully. Abraham's story is one of faith, obedience, and God's faithfulness, a story that would echo throughout history, shaping the lives of future generations. Jacob and Esau, the struggle of brothers. Jacob, the younger twin son of Isaac and Rebekah, grew up in a household full of tension. From the moment of his birth, he held on to Esau's heel, signifying his desire for the birthright meant for the firstborn. As the years passed, Jacob's faithfulness to God became evident. He sought to honor the Lord in all things and diligently followed his commands. He worked hard, trusted in God's promises, and showed righteousness in his actions, even when it wasn't easy. His devotion did not go unnoticed, and God saw his heart. One day Isaac, his father, grew old and blind. It was time to give Esau, the firstborn, the blessing of the family, a powerful and precious inheritance. However, Jacob, guided by his mother Rebekah's plan, disguised himself as his brother Esau to receive the blessing. When Isaac, confused and near the end of his life, spoke the blessing over Jacob, it was a defining moment in the story of God's plan. Jacob received the blessings of the firstborn, setting the stage for his future role as the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. Though the deception had been great, Jacob's faithfulness and desire to fulfill God's plan were clear, and this moment was one that would change the course of history. Esau's rebellion. Esau, the elder brother, was rough and wild. He didn't think much about the spiritual blessings that came with the birthright, showing little interest in honoring God. While Jacob worked to follow God's will, Esau sought pleasure in the here and now. His impulsive nature led him to sell his birthright to Jacob for a mere bowl of stew, showing just how little he valued what had been entrusted to him. Later, Esau married Canaanite women, which greatly displeased his parents and went against God's laws. He defied the covenant God had made with Abraham, and his life choices seemed to be a rejection of everything that was holy and sacred. In his heart, Esau had no regard for the spiritual inheritance that could have been his. This defiance would lead to conflict, as Jacob would later wrestle with Esau in a battle for family and faith, and their struggles would mark the story of their descendants for generations. The struggle and reconciliation. The years passed, and the brothers grew apart. Jacob fled from Esau's wrath after he deceived their father, leaving home for many years. But even though Jacob was on the run, God was with him, protecting him and guiding him. During these years, Jacob's character began to change. He learned humility, strength, and faith. Finally, after many years, Jacob returned home to face Esau. He feared for his life, but God had been preparing Esau's heart. When the two brothers finally met, Esau, in an unexpected act of grace, embraced Jacob. They reconciled, and the bitterness between them was washed away by forgiveness. This moment was a turning point for both of them. Jacob, whose name would later be changed to Israel, would go on to father 12 sons who would become the 12 tribes of Israel. Esau, though he missed the spiritual blessing, would also go on to become the father of the Edomites, a significant people in their own right. In this story, we see the struggle of two brothers, Jacob and Esau, who are each chosen for different purposes by God. Their lives are filled with tension, But ultimately, their story is one of faith, redemption, and reconciliation. Even in the midst of sin and mistakes, God's plan unfolds perfectly, showing that no matter our struggles or failures, God can still work through us to accomplish His will. Joseph was the youngest of Jacob's 12 sons, and he was deeply loved by his father. Jacob gave him a beautiful coat of many colors, making his brothers jealous. They saw how much their father favored Joseph and felt bitterness growing inside them. Joseph, unaware of the tension he caused, shared his dreams with his brothers. In his dreams, he saw himself as a leader, with his brothers bowing down to him. This made them angry, and they grew to hate him even more. One day, when Joseph came to visit his brothers in the fields, they saw an opportunity. Driven by jealousy and anger, they plotted to get rid of him. They threw him into a pit and later sold him to a group of Ishmaelite traders heading to Egypt. Joseph, confused and heartbroken, was taken far from his family, his dreams of greatness seeming like a distant memory. In Egypt, Joseph was sold as a slave to Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's guard. Despite his hardships, Joseph remained faithful to God. His determination, faithfulness, and integrity shone through, and soon, Potiphar noticed how blessed Joseph was. Joseph rose to prominence within his master's house, managing all of Potiphar's affairs. But just when things seemed to be looking up, tragedy struck. Potiphar's wife falsely accused Joseph of wrongdoing when he refused her advances, and he was thrown into prison. Even in prison, Joseph did not lose his faith. He continued to trust God, and God blessed him with the ability to interpret dreams. One day, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker were thrown into prison, and Joseph interpreted their dreams. His interpretations came true. The cupbearer was restored to his position, while the baker was executed. Before leaving, the cupbearer promised to remember Joseph, but he forgot about him. For 2 long years, Joseph remained in prison, but his faith never wavered. Then one day, Pharaoh had troubling dreams that no one could interpret. The cupbearer finally remembered Joseph and told Pharaoh about his gift. Joseph was brought before Pharaoh, and with God's help, he interpreted the dreams, foretelling 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. Pharaoh, impressed by Joseph's wisdom and the Spirit of God within him, made him the second in command over all of Egypt. Joseph's new role gave him the responsibility of preparing Egypt for the coming famine. During the 7 years of plenty, Joseph stored up grain in great quantities, preparing the land for the lean years ahead. When the famine struck, it affected not only Egypt, but also the surrounding nations. When Joseph's brothers living in Canaan heard that Egypt had food, they traveled there to buy grain, unaware that the brother they had sold into slavery was now the powerful ruler in charge. When they arrived, Joseph recognized them, but they didn't recognize him. He tested them, asking about their family and accusing them of being spies. Eventually, he revealed himself to them in a moment of deep emotion. "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt," he said. But instead of anger, Joseph spoke words of forgiveness. He told them that it was God's plan all along for him to be in Egypt to save their lives from the famine. Joseph's brothers were stunned and filled with guilt, but Joseph reassured them, saying, "Do not be afraid. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." He forgave them and invited them to bring their father Jacob and their families to live in Egypt, where they would be provided for during the remaining years of the famine. Joseph's reunion with his family was filled with joy and tears. His father, Jacob, was overwhelmed with emotion upon seeing his beloved son again, and they embraced, their years of separation and pain forgotten. The whole family moved to Egypt, where they were given the best land to settle in, fulfilling God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Joseph's story teaches us the power of forgiveness, the importance of faith through trials, and how God's plan can turn evil into good. Even in the darkest moments, Joseph trusted that God had a purpose for his life. His journey from a jealous brother's victim to a ruler in Egypt is a story of redemption and grace. God used Joseph to save not only his own family, but countless others from famine. And his story became a powerful testimony of God's faithfulness. This story emphasizes Joseph's unwavering faith in God's plan, his ability to forgive his brothers, and the beauty of redemption in God's hands. The Sabbath is more than just a day off from work. It's a sacred and powerful tradition that has deep roots in the history of the world. From the beginning of time, the Sabbath has been set apart as a day to rest, reflect, and worship. It's a day that connects us to God, to creation, and to the generations that came before us. In the Book of Jubilees, the Sabbath is mentioned over and over, showing just how vital it is. From the very beginning, in the creation story, God set the Sabbath apart as a special day. After creating the heavens, the earth, and all that is in them, God took the seventh day to rest, setting a perfect example for humanity. The Sabbath became a sign of God's work and a reminder of His goodness. But the Sabbath is more than just about rest. It's also about worship. For the patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Sabbath was a time to honor God for His blessings and protection. It wasn't just about ceasing from work. It was about turning hearts toward God in gratitude, prayer, and reflection. The Sabbath was a time to pause and recognize that everything we have comes from Him. When Moses received the laws from God, the Sabbath became an essential part of the covenant between God and His people. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a command. The Israelites were called to keep the Sabbath holy, setting it apart as a day of rest and worship. The importance of the Sabbath wasn't just in the physical rest it provided, but in the spiritual significance it carried. It was a sign of Israel's relationship with God and a way of showing their trust in His provision. Over the years, the Sabbath has been a source of peace and refreshment. It's a chance to take a break from the busyness of life and focus on what truly matters. Whether we spend the day in quiet prayer, gathering with others for worship, or simply resting in God's presence, the Sabbath offers a deep connection to our Creator. In our busy world, it's easy to forget the importance of taking time to rest and worship. But the Sabbath calls us back to a place of peace and reflection. It reminds us to slow down, to focus on God, and to appreciate the world He created. The Sabbath is a day to remember that, just as God rested after creating the world, we too are invited to rest in His care and embrace the blessings He gives. The giving of the law to Moses is one of the most pivotal moments in history. It wasn't just a set of rules. It was God's eternal plan unfolding. The commandments were a divine gift, a guide for His people to live by, and a reminder of His covenant with them. But what many don't realize is that these laws were not new. They were part of an ancient promise, one that was set into motion long before Moses stood on Mount Sinai. One day, while Moses was tending to his duties, he found himself before a strange sight, a burning bush that wasn't consumed by the flames. From within, a voice spoke to him, commanding him to take off his sandals, for he was standing on holy ground. This was no ordinary encounter. This was God Himself speaking directly to Moses. The angel of the Lord, the angel of the presence, appeared and delivered a powerful message. The laws Moses was about to receive were not simply new rules, but a continuation of God's eternal plan. The angel of the presence, a majestic and radiant being, spoke to Moses in a voice that seemed to echo through time. He revealed that the laws given at Mount Sinai were not inventions or sudden thoughts of God. They were a reflection of God's plan from the very beginning. From the days of Adam, Noah, and the patriarchs, these laws were already in motion. They were the foundation of the eternal covenant God had made with his people, a covenant that stretched back to the dawn of creation. Moses listened intently, and as the angel spoke, he could feel the weight of the words upon him. The laws, he was told, were not just to guide Israel in their relationship with God, but to help them live as a holy and separate people. They were a people set apart, chosen by God, and these laws would help them live righteously in a world that often seemed to forget the Creator. The angel's message was clear. The commandments were not just for Moses and the Israelites. They were for all of humanity. From the very beginning, God had set apart a group of people to be his representatives on earth, to show the world what it meant to live according to his will. The patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, had lived according to these principles. They had honored God, kept his commandments, and passed on these teachings to their children. And now it was Moses' turn to receive the fullness of the law and to lead Israel into obedience. As the angel spoke of the eternal covenant, Moses was reminded of the promises God had made to the patriarchs. God had promised Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars, and that they would inherit the land he had promised. This was a covenant that couldn't be broken, a promise that would stand the test of time. And the giving of the law was a part of fulfilling that promise. The commandments were not just laws, they were a way of life. They were the standards by which Israel was to live, and by living them, they would show the world that there was a God who loved them, a God who had a plan for them. The law was God's gift to his people, a gift that would guide them through the wilderness and into the land he had promised them. As Moses stood in awe before the angel, he understood that the giving of the law wasn't just a moment in time, it was part of God's eternal plan. It was a continuation of the covenant God had made with the patriarchs, a covenant that would never be broken. And with this understanding, Moses felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was not just a leader of a people, he was a servant of the Most High, tasked with leading God's people into the fullness of his promise. The angel's words stayed with Moses as he journeyed back to the people of Israel. They were to prepare themselves to receive the law, to hear the voice of God himself speaking from the mountain. The moment was approaching when the covenant would be sealed, and Israel would become a nation under the law, a nation devoted to God's service. And so, with the eternal covenant in mind, Moses gathered the people, ready to receive the law and to enter into the fullness of the promise God had made. It was a moment of profound significance, not just for Moses and Israel, but for the entire world. The law was not just for Israel. It was a blueprint for how all people were meant to live in relationship with God, living justly and righteously in his sight. Through the giving of the law, the people of Israel were called to be a light to the nations, to show the world what it looked like to live in covenant with God. And as Moses stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, the heavy clouds gathering above him, he knew that he was standing on the threshold of something greater than himself, something that would change the world forever. The Book of Jubilees, though rooted in the past, speaks powerfully of the future, offering prophecies and promises that reverberate through generations. As it draws to a close, the text shifts its gaze toward Israel's destiny, revealing both the trials they will face and the hope that will one day be realized. The prophecy begins with a somber prediction. Israel will face exile. Their disobedience and failure to uphold the covenant will lead them to be scattered among the nations. The people will suffer under foreign rule, and their beloved land will be desolate. But even in the midst of this despair, God's message remains clear. He has not abandoned them. The exile is a consequence, but it is not the end of the story. But the exile is not forever. The Book of Jubilees assures the people of Israel that God's faithfulness is unwavering. He will not forget his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Though they will endure hardships, God will one day bring them back to their land. They will return in peace and joy, restored to their rightful place as his chosen people. This promise is a beacon of hope, a light at the end of the tunnel, reminding them that God's covenant with them stands firm, no matter the storms they face. As part of Israel's future restoration, a new covenant is foretold. God will write his laws on their hearts, and they will no longer need to teach each other to know the Lord, for they will all know him personally. Their hearts will be changed, their spirits renewed, and their obedience to God will no longer be a matter of law alone, but of inner transformation. This new covenant promises a deeper, more intimate relationship with God, one based on love and faith, not just outward obedience. Central to the future prophecies and jubilees is the promise of a coming Messiah, who will bring justice, peace, and righteousness to the earth. This Messiah will be a king from the line of David, who will rule over Israel and all nations. Under his reign, the world will be filled with peace, and Israel will be restored to a position of honor among the nations. This reign will be characterized by righteousness, where God's will is done perfectly on earth as it is in heaven. The final chapters of Jubilees paint a picture of a future Israel, restored and blessed by God. The land will flourish with abundant crops, peace, and prosperity. God's people will live in harmony, and the nations will come to them for wisdom and guidance. Israel will be a light to the nations, fulfilling the promise given to Abraham, that through his descendants, all the families of the earth would be blessed. The Book of Jubilees ends with a powerful reminder of God's faithfulness. Despite the exile, the suffering, and the challenges Israel will face, God will fulfill every promise he has made. His covenant is everlasting, and his love for his people is unshakable. The prophecies and jubilees, those speaking of future trials, are filled with the hope of ultimate restoration and redemption. Imagine Israel, a people scattered and broken, yearning for the days of peace and prosperity promised to their ancestors. The shadows of exile hang heavy over them, but even as they suffer, the echoes of ancient promises ring in their hearts. God has not forgotten them, and he never will. Through the eyes of an Israelite living in exile, we see the weight of those promises. He dreams of returning to his land, walking again in the fields where his ancestors walked. He clings to the hope of a Messiah who will bring justice to a broken world, a king who will restore his people to their rightful place. As the people of Israel endure the hardships of their exile, the prophecies of the future offer them a glimmer of hope. A new covenant will be established, one that will transform their hearts. The land will be restored, and the blessings of God will overflow. They will no longer be a wandering people, but a nation at peace, living in the light of God's love. And so, the Israelites wait for the day when the promises of God will come to fruition. The exile will end, the Messiah will come, and Israel will once again shine as a beacon of God's faithfulness to the world. The Book of Jubilees offers a rich and detailed account of biblical history, presenting themes that are both timeless and practical. These themes invite readers to reflect on their own lives, to trust in God's sovereignty, and to live in obedience to his commands. The Book of Jubilees makes it clear that history is not a random sequence of events, but unfolds according to God's divine plan. From the creation of the world to the stories of the patriarchs and the establishment of God's covenant with Israel, the book underscores the fact that nothing happens by chance. God is in control of all things, and His plan for the world will ultimately be fulfilled, regardless of human failures or obstacles. No matter how uncertain or chaotic the world may seem, we can trust that God's purposes are being worked out in every moment. History is in His hands, and we are part of His grand plan. The patriarchs' lives demonstrate the blessings of trusting and obeying God. The Book of Jubilees highlights the lives of key biblical figures, such as Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and others, showcasing how their faith and obedience to God led to blessings. Abraham's unwavering trust in God, even when asked to sacrifice his son Isaac, and Jacob's commitment to God's covenant serve as powerful examples of how faith and obedience bring God's favor. When we trust and obey God, we align ourselves with His will, and His blessings follow. Faith is not just believing in God, but acting upon that belief, even when the path seems uncertain. The Book of Jubilees emphasizes the importance of the Sabbath, not just as a day of rest, but as a sign of covenant faithfulness. It highlights the creation of the world and how God set apart the seventh day as holy. The Sabbath is a day to pause, reflect, and dedicate time to God, showing that our relationship with Him is central to our lives. Observing the Sabbath is not merely a religious obligation. It's an act of faithfulness to God. It's a reminder that our lives should be centered on Him, and that true rest and peace come from honoring Him with our time. Throughout the Book of Jubilees, the concept of covenant faithfulness is a central theme. The patriarchs, as well as the people of Israel, are shown to thrive when they remain faithful to the covenant God established with them. Keeping God's commandments and living in accordance with His will is the key to experiencing His promises and blessings. God's covenant is an invitation to a relationship built on trust, commitment, and obedience. As believers, we are called to remain faithful to God, not just in moments of blessing, but in all circumstances. Our faithfulness brings us closer to His promises. The Book of Jubilees acknowledges the failures of humanity, particularly the mistakes and shortcomings of Israel, but it also reveals God's constant mercy and plan for redemption. Even when Israel strays from God's path, He promises to restore them. This redemption is not just for the Israelites, but extends to all of humanity through God's faithfulness and mercy. Despite our failures, God's mercy is greater. No matter how far we may fall, God's plan for redemption is always at work, offering us hope and the chance for restoration. We are never beyond His reach. The Book of Jubilees offers a fascinating blend of history, theology, and practical lessons. It allows readers to see how their own lives fit into God's unfolding story of redemption. The themes presented in the book call us to live with faith, purpose, and a deep understanding of God's sovereignty and faithfulness. Our lives are part of a much bigger story, God's story. We are invited to live with the confidence that His plan is being worked out in our lives, and to trust that He is guiding us toward His ultimate purpose. Just as the patriarchs lived by faith, we too are called to walk in obedience, knowing that God's promises will come to pass. May your spiritual journey be filled with God's grace and peace. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video to inspire others on their walk with the Lord.